Okay, ladies and gentlemen, we're going to start. Please, if you move from the back into your seats. Okay, we're going to now move after, I think, a very stimulating morning of presentations, which really frame the conversation we're now going to have on the future of energy in the Americas. This is our Armchair session. And it's my privilege to moderate this session with the illustrious members we have. Jim Hackett, you have all of the bios in your program. I will not repeat all of it. We don't have enough time, but Jim is chairman and CEO of Anadarko Petroleum Corporation. He's one of the leading corporate leaders in the energy sector in our country. But to me, the thing I have to worry about, he's also on the Rice University Board of Trustees, so I have to pay a lot of attention to him. And that's also an adjunct professor, which I commend you in teaching here. Our other participant is Scott Nyquist, who's a veteran of Baker Institute events. He's director of the global energy practice at McKinsey & Company, where he's worked since 1984. And he now co-leads McKinsey's global energy and materials sector and is a leader in McKinsey's climate change special initiative. And then the Honorable Philip R. Sharp, who became president of Resources for the Future in September 2005. His career in public service includes 10 terms as a member of the U.S. House of Representatives from Indiana, bravo, as well as a lengthy tenure on the faculty of the Harvard Kennedy School and the Institute of Politics and Harvard University. You almost had tenure in Congress, sir. So I will now go to the chair, and our format is that I'm going to ask some generic questions. I'm going to call on one of our participants to respond first, but then the others will chime in. And if we do have enough time, but I realize we're moving pretty late into the clock here, we'll take some questions.
I'm glad you're sitting down. Usually he dictates to me when we're on the board.
That is not true. Well, gentlemen, one basic question that I think we would all benefit from your collective wisdom is the following. Is the unconventional oil and natural gas resource boom a transformation of North American energy, or is it just an adjustment? That's one question, if you could give your predictions on that. And then also, how do you see the division between unconventionals and renewables in importance to the U.S. Energy mix over the next 10 years? In other words, are there winners and losers? Who wins and who loses? So, Jim Hackett, I'd like to turn the podium over to you first on this.
Thank you, Ed. Hello, everybody. First of all, I don't think it's a surprise to any of you in the room that it's transformational. And I speak from a fairly objective point, which is 5 years ago, I didn't think that natural gas should be expanded at all in terms of its usage in America. I thought it was much too precious a fuel for home heating to be using in the transportation sector. Now I'm one of the biggest proponents of using it, in fact, in the heavy-duty fleet vehicle market, as a way to actually enhance our national security, improve our air for those that are focused on climate change, to improve the dynamics that contribute to climate change from man-made emissions, and also, importantly, to provide us with a very affordable, scalable fuel for the future. And I think that, from my perspective, the surprising part about the story over the last 5 years is not natural gas, actually. Even though that's the one that surprised me the most, I thought. It's actually about North American oil. And you heard some comments earlier about the oil sands up in Canada. We have an opportunity, we believe, and this came out of the National Petroleum Council study that Phil Sharp was very engaged in with his staff, that we actually have an opportunity in the next 25 years to almost double the production of North American oil without Mexico becoming better. And that's a stunning, stunning thing to think about. The combination of using North American natural gas with North American oil can make us so much less dependent, actually passing through what people would consider to be independence in energy of less than 20% of foreign imported oil. That's how dramatic the transformation has been in a time when in 30 years in my career, which will tell you how old I am because that means there's 5 left still that I've played a part in. For 30 years, nobody thought that could be done on either commodity. Certainly not in oil since the late 70s, and not on gas since the mid 70s. And so this is a really, really big deal for North America. And what is a bit stunning to me is people are actually wondering whether they want to really do it. Now, back to solar and wind. I don't think there's any incongruence between the expansion of natural gas. It's actually required, as we all know, to support wind and solar. What some people have chosen to do is interpret for you and me what the answer ought to be on energy. They've interpreted that answer ought to exclude anything that is hydrocarbon-based. And I reject it completely. And the reason why I reject it is because they can't keep the promise. The promise is they can afford you an affordable source of energy that allows the economy to actually grow and provide jobs and is still scalable. And I don't buy either of those arguments with regard to what has been proposed today. I would be much more interested if, in fact, they were trying to pursue ocean technologies, which in my view are actually scalable. Now, that being said, I think we should build wind, we should build solar where it makes sense to do it, and you're going to need natural gas to back it up. But I find natural gas to be a much more scalable fuel as an answer.
Thank you, Jim. Phil, start.
Well, I think it clearly falls on the spectrum of transformational as opposed to an adjustment. And it's going to, over the next several decades or next decade, depending on international development of shale gas, it can even enhance a significant change in the global politics around energy production and distribution. Not that we or anybody else around the world is never going to have to worry about what is happening in the international oil market or the international gas market, as that will develop further over the next couple decades. So, and then as Jim has said, here within our own economy and the North American, it's a major new economic driver potentially for us. Obviously, we can screw this up, so let's not forget that proposition. But it's also, is very significant on the environmental side. And here, it's not obvious what the actual outcome will be. Clearly, natural gas has a number of cleaner characteristics than, for example, coal. But what matters is what does the marketplace and what does the policy drive us toward. And getting to that issue of what will happen on the renewables side of the equation, frankly, renewables development began to take off in this country again after, I don't know when it was, about 2007 or 6. The 2000 Energy Act of 2005 helped accelerate it, 2007, and then 2009. All of these had elements that helped promote those fuels in this society. But the big thing that was happening was oil and gas prices were going up. And with that happening, it clearly made these other fuels much more likely in the marketplace and closer to market prices than they had been for a number of years. But the issue becomes what happens now if the natural gas prices stay what we would say is reasonably low as a result of this new production, which surprised virtually everybody, as Jim was alluding to. Then if we left it to strict market with no government intervention, probably we would see not only a failure to grow in those fuels, but we would see a rapid decline as people could get out of them, because generally they are higher cost projects than would be a natural gas electricity production. And I'm on the board of directors of Duke Energy, and I'm not speaking for the company or directly from its plans here, but it's very widely recognized in the utility industry that if you'd asked them even 2 years ago and 3 years ago, would they build a serious natural gas plant, not just a peaker, they would have been, I don't know about that, because the natural gas prices, we got burned around the turn of the decade, and we don't want to get burned again because this fuel takes off in price after we have overbuilt, which essentially was what happened for about less than a decade in this country. And so, but that skittishness has almost evaporated. So that the tough decision in boards of directors and others is maybe we should just invest in a new natural gas plant, cheaper to invest as long as we have supply, and skip the plans on the nuclear plant, on the coal plant, on the environmental the fuels kind of thing, because they're just more expensive. Let me do say, I did want to say, I appreciate being invited, delighted to be here. Frankly, as a former member of Congress, I'm pleased to be invited about anywhere.
Well, let me build on Jim and Phil's points. I agree very much with some of the conclusions. Just to describe the impact, 5-10 years ago, we were all looking at the prospect of having to import LNG in order to meet our energy needs. And with all the new technology coming on unconventional gas, we now have gas, today wasn't below 250, so just a radical transformation. And that's been very good. One little story I'd like to tell on it is that last year, California paid $4 per billion BTU per gas. And where in Germany, they're paying $10 per billion BTU because they're competing in the global marketplace. So this is the gift that Texas has given to our friends in California, another gift of the fossil fuels.
Always happy to help them out.
Yes, exactly right.
They deserve it so much.
But from a renewables point of view, this is a very tough story. If you were back in 2003, 2005, and you look at higher oil prices and importing LNG, you could justify economics that would be quite attractive for wind and solar. And it led to a lot of creation of companies, a lot of opportunities to invest in wind and plans to put in solar, very optimistic views of how that would play out. And then with the new gas price coming in, all these economics have been disrupted. And now when you look ahead just on a pure economic basis, much lower penetration of solar and wind. So a radically different story for the role that those fuels could play in the future of the U.S. Now, one bit of hope, just to provide the optimistic view for solar, is that we do see lots of improvements in solar technology and economics coming. The price has come way down from 1975, where they were $100 per watt peak, down to $7.50 to 2007, and $2.50 to $3 today in some places. And now what we see happening is big companies coming in, companies like Samsung and Hanwha, that are a consumer electronics company, and they're coming in with the idea that we're going to drive mass production and deploy all our technologies that we have to produce things at scale at very low cost. And they can see just by deploying those new manufacturing techniques, they can drive the cost down further. And they also look at the market from a global point of view. They say there are little niche markets around the world. We'll sell a few solar panels in California. We got some in Africa. When we're competing in rural areas in India, we can compete there. And so they can see how they can begin to put that volume in a global marketplace, drive down the cost. And as they drive down the cost, it'll expand the marketplace. So maybe today, 1% of the US market might be economic for solar, some places in California where the regulations are right. By 2020, if gas pops up to about 5 or 6, you can make that happen, Jim, that'd be good, then we'd end up having maybe 25% of the market for residential commercial open for solar panels. So a huge opportunity if we can go down that path. So that's the voice of optimism on the solar side in terms of trying to grow that business despite the enormous economic headwinds from their point of view that gas brings to them.
We're picking up on some of your comments. We've seen enormous breakthroughs in unconventional resources in the United States. They've come through free market forces, not by government intervention. But the boom is currently bringing about very inexpensive natural gas prices. You touched upon that. What will be the impact of high global oil prices and low U.S. natural gas prices on North America's unconventional natural gas development? And is the infrastructure ready? You want to try to take that on?
Would you like to do it first?
Now that you
I'd be happy to do it.
Happy? Okay.
Yes, and I should mention that actually the CEO at Duke, who is a friend, Jim Rogers, I remember him on a panel at Harvard saying that natural gas was the crack cocaine of the utility industry about 2.5 years ago. And so it's interesting to see how these views have kind of changed. As Phil mentioned, prudent development is going to be a very important part of anything we do, whether it's solar technologies, whether it's natural gas, whether it's oil, particularly oil. I think the discontinuity between oil and natural gas is one that always existed. We had hoped, I guess, as a gas producer, that there would always be some sort of BTU parity between the two products, because we always saw natural gas as being tied to oil from an energy perspective, but the truth is it's not consumed in the same places anymore. At one time you could switch power plants between the two in the United States. You still can do that in some parts of the world, but not here domestically. So they actually serve very different markets and uses except in the petrochemical side. And there you can actually get the benefit on the natural gas side of producing what are called natural gas liquids, which are things like ethane and propane that they use to make ethylene and propylene from, that you would otherwise do from a naphtha kind of off product on oil. So there is some connection on the petrochemical side. The good thing is for the petrochemical business is as long as there's enough natural gas, they can actually get those natural gas liquids at a much cheaper price than oil-derived naphtha. So they are loving what's going on in North America to the extent where 10 years ago, North America was the last place anybody would build a petrochemical plant. And now you have 4 different companies announcing they will in fact build plants in North America again, which is bringing back some industrial might to America, along with the fertilizer industry rising back up again. A guy who runs one of the largest fertilizer companies in the country, ICF Industries, Steve, was on a panel with me in New York about 2 months ago, and he said to the group of assembled CEOs, he said, the natural gas phenomena in North America is the biggest single transformational thing I have seen in my career, which has been spent in the fertilizer industry. That's how powerful he thinks it is. And he said, when you think about the connection with one of our great export products, food, and the fact that we are enabling reasonably priced agricultural goods from low natural gas prices, what a fabulous story that is for the world. We're not just helping America, we're actually helping the world indirectly through exported products. So it isn't just about whether we participate in the liquefied natural gas trade, but also whether we participate in kind of the global economy on industrial goods as well. So I hope that the discontinuity actually continues, and I love that natural gas prices are low, not because it's good for our shareholders, but because it will lead to secular change in North America in terms of consumption patterns, and it should.
Let me just, a little caution. I've only been an observer, and I was in policy-making position at one time and stuff like that, and I don't purport to get into this with the kind of detail and analysis that many of you in the audience and have to make the tough decision about how many billions to invest here or there. So I put this as a caveat. But the one thing that most of us have observed over the last 30, 40 years, some of us have been around that long, is that many unexpected things happen in these markets. One of the reasons I believe in open markets, because we have great difficulty foreseeing the future. There's some obvious things, but this disparity in oil and natural gas prices is huge at the moment. And as John Deutsch, I mean, obviously some people want to export the gas to get into the higher international gas market. Probably makes no difference to the domestic market for how many years out. It'd have to be a fairly large amount before it would start to make a difference. But we don't know how many different things are going to respond to this low natural gas. Right now, we've already seen a huge jump in electric generation on gas. Of the existing gas plants that were built and either not run or run at very small capacity for many years, that's jumped immediately as it had the opportunity with this lower priced gas. So at what point does the new onshore, which is very positive development of fertilizer, at what point does the rush of the utility system to natural gas, at what point does, if various people get into the vehicle business, at what point do we export, at what point does this change those broad market things? Now, prices go up and down a little bit, that's not what's important. That's when it goes way up or way down. That really shifts things. Just an example of that differential as I understand it, and I'm reluctant to say something in front of Jim Carver, who knows this in and out, but my impression is that our expectation in the United States 15 years ago on Canadian natural gas imports, which was for many years our marginal additional supply in this country, was that suddenly that flattened out. Why? Because it made sense to take a lot of that natural gas and use it in the oil sands development, and that was no longer going to be available as the extra marginal supply. We're talking about the increments now. We're not talking about, there was never a withdrawal of natural gas from Canada. But why? Well, of course that made sense. You could get so much more out of that oil. It made worth investing in the oil given the differential in oil when the oil prices went so sky high. So we simply don't know. It was those radical improvements in natural gas prices at the early part of this decade that led George Mitchell and others in this business to say, we don't buy the big oil companies. They don't get it. We can make money in this. They're going to invest elsewhere. We're going to invest here. And why do we do that? One, we believe in it, but two, we have a good price on natural gas for the first time in a century, and we're going to go for it. And they did. So all I'm saying is, we want to keep policy and we want to keep the market open to options, because if we start betting on this, as we now have the conventional wisdom, we know right exactly where natural gas is going to be in 15 years. I'll lay you odds 10 to 1. If it's anything like the last 40 years, we'll be wrong.
You mentioned McKinsey's recent study suggesting that both unconventional oil and gas and clean tech can be competitive in the 2020s. There are policymakers in Washington who would like to orchestrate a more concerted shift to wind and solar. How realistic is this, given the vast size of unconventional resources we've been discussing all morning?
Well, as I mentioned before, I think the low gas price environment we have today really hits hard into renewable economics and makes it very, very difficult. And then we throw in a little bit of government deficit and debt. It makes it very hard to provide the subsidies if you really wanted to push for those types of fuels coming in. So I end up being quite pessimistic on how far they'll go compared to what we had hoped for 5, 10 years ago. But as I mentioned, I am optimistic that some solar can come in and that can make a difference. And I also would say I'm optimistic from a climate change point of view, that once we work our way through the economic difficulties we have, and if the scientists' views on the impact of greenhouse gas emissions continues to gain credibility and confidence, we can see that a carbon price of some sort could come back in the future. Whether you say $25 or $50 or $500 a ton, whatever price range you need, that will certainly have a big impact on solar and wind. And if the economics of those technologies continue to go down, and then you get some help from carbon prices, you can see them re-entering the marketplace in a more substantial way, probably post-2020.
I think this is the biggest absence of what we're going to have to deal with in the future, is making up our minds as to how intensive a carbon policy we want in this country, and obviously it shapes it around the world too. This is not a domestic problem alone, but whether or not we are going to move with any kind of speed or any kind of a commitment toward that. We have a variety of things that actually do things about climate change in the United States, but what Jim was telling us about Alberta, there it is, a tough producing state that has decided they are going to have at least a climate policy that will shape this. This is going to shape us. Now, we can design that so it wrecks the economy, or we can design it so we have time to adjust. So I'm not here to debate about the range of options that you have in this is huge kind of thing. But having some knowledge about what those parameters are going to be would be extremely useful, not only from an environmental perspective, but from an industry perspective. Because then you would make your calculation of, if you have a budget of CO2 for the country, that as long as you're building a nuclear power plant, you got more room for natural gas and other kind of production kind of thing in your mix. And the same with how many renewables are in there. One of the political phenomena we're facing it on the Keystone Project, whatever you believe is the rationality or irrationality of the argument, is we are likely to see an intensification of political fights over all kinds of energy developments over the carbon molecule. And these carbon fights. And since we don't have a broad policy, it's a little hard to intellectually claim these carbon molecules don't matter, those do. And my preferred method, and many preferred method, is to try to get a slowly rising price on carbon established by the government either through a tax or a cap and trade system, which over time allows plenty of time for adjustment, that people have a projection where they know, and leave it to the private sector to make the tough choices as to where to make the investments, which kind of activities we can get more efficient at or not efficient at, kind of thing.
Jim, you want to comment on that? Or? No. Okay.
Well, the report he and I worked on suggested that a carbon tax would make some sense. The key is at what level it's set.
That's very important.
And as an American citizen, of course, maybe you have more trust in the federal government than I do. It would be handy to know how they're going to spend it.
Well, there's a new debate, and our organization does not promote the carbon tax, nor do I personally. I do prefer pricing as the technique, but we're actually engaging a number of political leaders in Washington, both parties, a number of major industries right now in examining the various elements of what you would do with the revenue, what you would do with the design of the tax, because there are big issues that'll be in conflict over that, just as there were on cap and trade and everything else. But one of the key political reasons it might come back on the agenda is not because of suddenly a new rush of concern about working on carbon, but it is because if you want to engage in serious tax reform, which many believe is important to the economy apart from equity issues, that you're going to need an additional source of revenue. The theory that you can simply cut deductions and that will add up to all the rates you'd like to cut, most people don't believe either economically or politically adds up. So you need this. So the point is, some very conservative organization in Washington, D.C. right now is looking at this as the technique by which to fund serious tax reform. And of course, we do have a minor problem with the deficit.
So if we assume that unconventional resource production is not going to go away, what should be done to build public confidence? Mr. Deutsch made a big point of this, the need for, if you will, public communication and education. So what needs to be done by industry, by government, by the environmentalists? Jim, you want to?
I think we should start with making sure that we all do good science. I think one of the drawbacks, even in the climate debate, unfortunately, was the attempt by some to propose it as an exact science. I think it would have been much fairer to suggest that there's a probability that man-made emissions are going to contribute to climate change in a very, very negative way. But that it was difficult to make the nexus on a mean case. And I think that scientists people like me that work in a scientific business would have lent a lot more credibility to that effort. I think what happened was the emotion and the political agenda got ahead of the science, and I see a bit of that in our industry as well. It would not surprise you that people who are big supporters of wind and solar would somehow come out against natural gas development. We're seeing some of that, in fact, today. And what happens is that you see occasional forays into what is a non-scientific realm. I think it's clear that most people now think that the Cornell study on methane emissions was grossly exaggerated in any scientific manner that you can possibly imagine. We frankly think that the Duke study was a bit flawed. We have our own issues on that. The Pavilion release that was done by the EPA, in my personal view, was irresponsible, and I've told the administration that. We had an agreement, all of us, with Congress that EPA would go and study the issue on hydraulic fracturing, make sure that they came back with a peer-reviewed study, not to issue kind of preliminary reports in the most sensitive area you could pick in the country early on in the equation, not have it peer-reviewed, and then ask for volunteers to peer review when you get pushback from the industry. And I think Encana, who operates up there, is on record as saying that they have some very big questions about the methodologies used there. Even the Department of Interior has suggested there's some issues with that. Those are the kind of things that don't help to create a trusting, positive dialogue, because at the end of the day, this all happens through people. So what I believe is Peter Lerner, who appeared earlier, his team helped us on the MPC study. We got to know Phil's group much more from the study, the EDF people we got to know. That kind of relationship building is what's going to determine how we can responsibly make sure that prudent development occurs in this country. Using guerrilla tactics is probably not the right way to make sure that we do it. So what we have had to do is actually fight a bit on the science side, which is unfortunate because we should all be aligned that what we want is scientific answers. If there are scientific answers that say something's going wrong, we should fix it. And I'm talking about society and the industry should be there first. So our objective is to make sure that we, for the first time in my career, we're actually hiring toxicologists. I don't even know how to say the word epidemiologist. Somebody who's got a medical background can tell me. That tells you why I've never hired them, right? We don't know even how to. So from my perspective, the industry is putting a lot of money and effort into making sure that we do respond scientifically. We're not taking this for granted at all, that our license to operate is unfettered. We have all learned from the nuclear industry unfortunate issues around 3 Mile Island, which I think was a a really unfortunate answer for our country that something that sort of worked when it didn't work in Russia shut down a new technology, the only energy technology that we developed in the 20th century. And so we are obviously highly, highly aware that we need to make sure society is comfortable that we prudently operate. We have a number of efforts underway in that regard. The MPC study itself recommended centers of excellence, as you know from John Deutsch's speech this morning. His subcommittee did that. We worked with that subcommittee to make sure that we had an approach that was going to be more proactive. So one of the things you will see the industry doing, Ed, in short, as a shorter answer to your question, is we are trying to get ahead of this issue. I have complete confidence that there are elements on both sides of the table that will continue to create non-scientific fears. And we should be very careful as a society to make sure that people don't appeal to our fear instinct as much as our good sense instinct. And I think if we do good sense, good science, we will get way more on the page with each other on the responsible way to do this than if we do the opposite.
I think,
Phil?
I certainly would not disagree at all with anything Jim said, and he's been a leader on the MPC study and elsewhere of trying to get industry to be forward-looking in best practices and to both develop the science for industry, but also for the regulators so that both sides of the equation are well-staffed. But one thing that we should recognize is it seems improbable. I think the way we make decisions, government decisions, because we have government authorities so divided in this country, and we don't want them concentrated, by the way, is that there will not be a yes or no Washington decision about this, okay? What's going to happen is multiple decisions are going to be made in all kinds of jurisdictions that make it either more difficult or easier for the production to occur. And what this is a heavy burden for people like your company that have to participate in multiple places because you're dealing with different levels of knowledge, different levels of activity. And it does require, and many of the companies are doing this, is my impression now, a much more aggressive public outreach in the local area where you are engaging in the development and production. And that is tough stuff. Anybody who's run for office can tell you, and you ought to have some sympathy for some of us. It is not simple. And if you think it's Republican or Democrat, or you think it's left or right, get over it. That's the way we talk in the general politics. The minute you are into somebody's backyard, I don't care what their ideology is, I don't care what their religion is, they get a different kind of perspective on things, and they are either your friend or your enemy. And they either know the county commissioner or the state regulator or whatnot, and they know them better than you do. Unless you happen to be local. And so these are where the fights are likely to occur, and this requires this. Now, some people believe that it's going to be a benefit that the larger companies have now gotten into the business, not because everybody that's a small business person is evil or bad, but it's because they don't have the same resources that are available to both do the community outreach and to make sure they're advancing the technology to do that. Now, to be frank about it, it was the small guys that made this all work, so let me just be very clear about my view that we want them in the business kind of thing. But what it is it's a matter of the discipline it takes to carry out both the community relations and, more importantly, the actual drilling and production so that mistakes aren't made. It's the kind of place which the nuclear industry painfully came to have to recognize that if you screw up your operation, I get hurt. Because it brings out the public and the regulator and all the market kind of problems. And so I now have an interest in, even though we're tough competitors, it's a very hard thing to get past, is the competition is to recognize we have a common interest in trying to make sure that this production is managed effectively with the minimal result on the environment.
Just to build on that, I mean, what we observe in our work is when we spend time with these companies that are involved in the drilling and spend time with the engineers, we see this growing confidence that this is something we can manage effectively. We can manage the system effects of water and waste. We can do it. So they're getting more and more confident with every well that they drill. At the same time, we go outside the industry, and there's a large segment of society that every day that goes by, they get less confidence that the industry can actually do it. So there's this growing disconnect between those two groups. We also see that each of the various constituents have kind of got into their corner. So we have the predictable people who would be fighting against anything the fossil fuel industry would do, out there fighting guns a-blazing. We have the industry itself doing what you would expect, advertising to talk about the virtues of natural gas. And so they're beginning to kind of get locked into that mode. I think there's a big role for people like the Baker Institute and others like them to cut through the facts and provide some independent, objective perspectives on this thing. There are not many institutions out there that have the trust to do that. I wouldn't say the government has it, nor industry, but there are opportunities for institutes like this to get out there and say, here's what the facts are on greenhouse gas emissions. Here's what the facts we see. So I'll encourage that, an opportunity for this group to take it forward.
Well, we're certainly going to do that. But drilling down now on what we've just discussed, and I saw a CNN news alert yesterday, and it was entitled, "Man-Made Earthquake in Ohio Because of Hydraulic, Fracking and Drilling." The public perception is beginning to take form, that there's something evil, there's something bad, there's something that private corporations are not disclosing. So let's address that more specifically. What is your assessment, each one of you, of the environmental risk from hydraulic fracturing? I know we can't have definitive answers, and how, but more importantly, how should they be approached? And so what do you see as the optimum path forward in terms of dealing with this perception?
Yeah, I think Phil was right about we talk about hydraulic fracturing, but it's really a proxy for community impacts. And I think we need to be very, very aware, as Phil says, that when you get in someone's backyard, there is a winner and loser. Frankly, it works the same way on solar and wind, too. Mm-hmm. A number of you have friends in West Texas where one property owner or ranch owner has wind farms on its land, the other one doesn't, and it doesn't particularly like looking at the wind farms of the neighbor. And they're not getting any revenue from the wind farm, so you can understand. In eastern Pennsylvania, they don't have much activity. In western Pennsylvania, they do. Within the local communities in Williamsport, Pennsylvania, there are people that have leased land, others that haven't. Some people are collecting royalties. They're happy as heck. Some are not. And all they see is the truck traffic that's increased on their roads. And so to Phil's point, I think we have to be much better at community outreach and trying to explain what the benefits are for those that aren't getting a direct financial benefit. Is there a benefit to the fact that their taxes won't be raised as much as they otherwise would have been, or in fact their deficits are being reduced in a local community or state? But those are the sorts of things that it's just like in a workplace. You have to explain to the people that work there what the advantages of working there are. Sometimes we don't all realize what's hidden there in the benefits equation, let's say, which is 40% of the salary load. It's worth taking some time to talk to people about what it's worth to them, about the things they don't typically think about. So I think one of them is education, being proactive in that. Two is, I think, trying to come together with the NGO community as best we can to avoid scare things happening. The truth is that you have to separate hydraulic fracturing from injection wells. Injection wells are not just used in this industry. They're used in the geothermal industry, which most people would think is a great renewable energy source. They're also used in other industries for wastewater. They're also used for saltwater disposal. And the EPA regulates it under the Clean Water Act, under the SDWDA, which they don't do on hydraulic fracturing, which is one of the issues people are talking about. So it's highly regulated on the injection side. And the reason why you can have seismic activity is you're sending large volumes of water at high pressures under the ground for an extended period of time. The fact that it has seismic activity should not cause you concerns as human beings. The truth is the particular instances you're citing, those were occurring before well activity was occurring on the lands. I mean, Oklahoma and some of these other ones have been cited. There hasn't been a connection with drilling actually occurring. These were seismic areas even before that time. But let's say we find a seismic area, then we say, well, what does it do to human impacts? The truth is, if you and I could get the economy to grow 1% greater and we had seismic activity that never had any human detriment to it, would you accept that risk? I, as a citizen, would. If America decides not to, that's its choice. But I would hope that America did it based on knowledge as opposed to fear tactics. So we use the word earthquake as if it's a 7 Richter scale, destroy home, destroy people type thing. The truth is, when it's 2, it's not. We induce seismic activity and we measure it with hydraulic fracturing. That's the exact intent of the technology, to actually fracture the ground. So would it surprise any of you? It doesn't surprise us that there's seismic activity related to hydraulic fracturing. The key is, do we measure it? We do. We do microseismic analysis. We actually can track how far it disperses, and we have it on an electronic log available to anybody that wants to come and look at it. So I think we've got to make the distinction between seismic activity. Is it really related to drilling, or is it related to something else? Is it always an active area? And make sure that we know what the trade-offs are if we decide that we want to take away licenses to operate because somebody put something in our head that we just can't get out of our head. Now, that's the industry's issue too. So we're very clear that we have to educate the American public about those issues too. So the minute something like that happens, we as an industry need to reply with good science. Because if you don't see that, we all know in politics, an unanswered claim is a valid claim. Now, that's not the way it should work, but it is. So you will see us be much quicker to address those things with all these technical skill sets that we never used to have.
Just to elaborate a little bit, when we talk about the general public, this is not going to be voted on by a national referenda, not on climate change and not on this. And what we're totally talking about are local publics and divided publics, and that's where the work has, that's exactly what you're doing, is doing the work in those areas, and that's a harder proposition. But it also can be very productive. If you take national polls on nuclear power, and you take polls around nuclear power plants, including in the post-Fukushima period, because the industry does this very regularly, kind of thing, you find very high rates of approval for existing power plants, maybe not Indian Point, north of New York City. That's the one, the most complicated one probably in the system today. But you find local populations in very strong support of that, and not to the same percentage, but willing to take on a new nuclear power plant. So the notion that the public is against nuclear power and we're not going to build nuclear plants is a very common phrase in American politics, but it's, in my view, almost irrelevant, because that's not where the decisions are going to be made, and it's not the public that is the most relevant. Mind you, if you're trying to build a nuclear power plant, you'd love that everybody loved it, but that's not the way the world works. So.
Yeah, we'll just build on Phil's point. I mean, what we've just observed at the local level, just an example. 3-4 years ago, there was this NGO that was operating in the Pennsylvania, New York area, and they called us up and saying, McKinsey, could you just give us all kinds of information to show how this drilling is going to destroy our environment? That was their first question. And they were quite serious about it. They were looking around for data to kind of crush this movement. Well, as time goes on, a year or two later, the question came back again and said, could you give us some data on the economic benefit, GDP growth, jobs that come from this thing, and you can help us figure out what's the right way to regulate this industry so they don't screw it up. So, this is an example of people in the community locally trying to find out the right answer. There are elements of folks who are searching for truth, and if the data comes out scientifically, this is the truth, they will go after it. So I'm actually optimistic that we're going to muddle through. I'm not quite as optimistic as John would be on the continuous improvement model, but on the muddle through model, I think we'll get it.
Well, also, I just think it's very important to say that it's so easy when you're in one camp or the other to demonize the other party and just, they're stupid and they're corrupt or they're whatever it is, but that justifies whatever you do, either politically or economically. And this game gets played by all kinds of organizations in this country, highly respected, some of them religious in nature. So you can see I take a point of view of politics that isn't totally elevating. But the point, the point is that the system that allows, one of the good benefits to our system that we've learned from Soviet experience and other places is we allow these intervening voices to come into play, sometimes out of ignorance and sometimes quite misrepresented, but oftentimes there is a kernel of truth, or there is a real problem, that there are real pollution that occurs. And industry has to make up its mind at that point, not industry, plural, it's whoever the individual players are, as to how they're going to respond. Are they going to respond with taking the issue seriously, as opposed to just, well, we know those people are way off base on most things, or are they going to say, yep, that's something we're going to address, that's where we're going to go for continuous improvement, that's where we're going to help the regulator get the right information, and that is a different attitude. And there are different companies and different organizations within them that play that differently. I would suggest over time, it is a wiser policy to swallow hard at the criticism that comes and try to ascertain which are real and which things have to be addressed. This goes to your commitment to science. We have to really take that seriously on all sides. Very hard to do in the public arena. That's not, we don't have that kind of conversation in America in public. We'd rather argue vehemently and exchange ignorances.
Unfortunately, we're running quickly out of time, and I have several more questions, but I really want to open it up to the audience, have a chance for a couple of questions, just 2 questions from the audience. If you go to the mic, the standing mics, we just could take 2 questions, please.
I have sort of 2 thoughts, and I wonder what you would think. A lot of the back and forth, the name-calling and the opposition, to me, seems to be based on a very long history of anti-oil, anti-big profits. And we talked about the disparity of the reality of plentiful gas, low gas prices, and high oil prices. But a lot of times that I think the initiative and the emotion for green energy and for new non-oil things is really also a function of this I don't know, reality and sort of distortion of reality about oil and profits and monopolies and that sort of thing. It doesn't exist as deeply in the UK. I don't know about other places, but it is certainly a big thing here. The other thing is that we talk about science and discussion and all the rest. What about commercial interests being as important as science?
I'm not sure I get the question.
Yeah, I think it was more a comment than a question, but your points are taken. Good. We're on. There's no
microphone here. Shout. we know yes. You can get this message out.
Wikipedia is down.
You're safe.
Yeah, I was trying to tie the second talk with this one. Obviously, we're losing in the court of public opinion on fracking and shale in general. But Jim's an operator, and people fear the unknown. Why can't you and your fellow operators tell the service companies to reveal the magic sauce in their fracking fluids and take that risk of the unknown away from the people that are affected?
No, it's a good question. I think you may know that we were one of the original proposers of FracFocus, which is a disclosure mechanism. It's actually something the industry needed to get on right away. To Phyllis' point, when you know that there's an issue, that was a no-brainer in the sense that you think what you will call something a witch's brew if you don't know what's in the brew. Here you've got 99% of the product being silica and water, but it's that 1% that if people knew that you have less benzene in that 1% than you have in cans of Coke, you'd probably be more comfortable. But if you can't tell them what it is, why should they trust you? Now, this is on the heels of Macondo, too, right? So we have to do a better job. So we got after this program called FracFocus. We've actually gotten several states to adopt it as the disclosure mechanism, because part of the problem is you've got people distributing well information and frac fluid information into one system in a state, and then you've got them doing it again in FracFocus, and that's a bit tough to ask people to do with thousands of wells. So we're getting more uniformity across the nation, with that being the disclosure mechanism, including with the Department of Interior, that we went to and suggested that they ought to mandate it on all BLM lands. I mean, that's where I think Phil is right. We've got to, as an industry, say when you know there's a problem, you got to go fix it. And you got to tell everybody who's engaged in the business with you to go fix it too, right? Now, there still is some IP issues that the service companies claim. We've protected that through the FracFocus system. We as a producing community, as you suggest, or intimate, don't believe those IP issues are as big as some of them might think. But at the end of the day, to get them all to do it properly, we did that. But the states see it. The states can see what they want to see. The public may see a little bit less than maybe the states see, but you got to have confidence it's residing somewhere with somebody objective who's not engaged in the business.
By the way, I would kind of challenge that the fracking and natural gas production is losing the public thing. I'm not sure that's accurate. I don't have any
Bulgaria.
doubt. Pardon me?
Look at Bulgaria and Chevron in the last couple of days.
Yeah, well, I haven't.
Who cares? They don't produce anything, right? It's like France. Okay, thank you.
Well,
and they won't be allowed to try.
Well, some of the places are ruling it out. But things change, people. After you discover that Poland's making a lot of money and they're able to do this ahead because they've already stood up in organizations in Europe and said, screw you, we're not going on with the EU idea that we got to go slow at this. We intend to produce this thing. That's what's happening in many communities around the country. There are conflicts, and we shouldn't misunderstand that, and there are things that I think industry is wise to try to manage, but the notion that just because there are some television programs and things that take it on, there's a great tendency for people to jump to the conclusion, oh my God, everybody believes that. Well, most people aren't paying attention. Let's start with rule number one. Most of us in our lives don't have time to focus on all these issues if we're not in the business. So I don't believe it's lost in that way, and I also don't believe it's just like, I mean, the nuclear decision by Merkel's government, this was a return to the government decision previously, and it may get undone in 4 years when they discover they have to replace all those nuclear power plants if they genuinely phase them out. And Sweden, by the way, if I forget what it was, they were going to get rid of all nuclear power a long time ago, and they never quite did it. So I'm a little more sanguine that things change, people grow. Just like this, the example he gave where people come in and say, well, wait a minute, what does this do for us? Because this is very important economic resource for local communities, local landowners, city budgets, state budgets, and all kinds of things. It is a huge economic resource, and I personally think there's no way in hell the United States government is going to come to a strong conclusion that prevents it. What is more likely to happen is you require certain things, and those add costs, or they inhibit the ability to get in there, and that will shape whether it's this much or this much or this much, as opposed to, you know, we win or lose, excuse me.
You know, I met with the Philadelphia Inquirer editorial staff yesterday. Every one of those people in that room knew that gas utility bills had gone down by $1,000 a year for Pennsylvania residents. That's big time stuff. They all knew their electric bills were lower. They all knew their gas utility bills were lower. Does that excuse any kind of imprudent development? Absolutely not. But to Phil's point, what it does is it gives a more balanced picture about why we don't want to give up on this too quickly. And it gives you a starting point to say, let's have an intelligent discussion instead of just saying, well, we can live without it. I don't think the Bulgarians 10 years from now will assume they can live without a reasonably priced resource if it's available in their country. I think the same is true of France. As you know, New Jersey banned it, nobody's there, and then they went back to a one-year ban that the governor put in because he wanted to just study the science around it. Why ban something forever that might make sense someday?
It's lunchtime, we'll talk later.
Yeah.
Ladies and gentlemen, join me in thanking our excellent panelists.
Thank you.
Lunch is being served in the tent outside the Baker Institute, Baker Hall. Terrific, Jim. Really good. Very, very, very good. You all enjoyed it.